Muchas gracias, Totoya. Buenos días, bogotanos. Estoy muy feliz de estar en Bogotá. Muchas gracias por la invitación. Thank you all for the kind welcome that you've given me here in Bogotá. It's an honor to be here today with you. As Totoya said, I'm a researcher with the Center for Addictions Research in British Columbia. I'm also Vice President of Patient Research and Services for Tilray. But in a past life, I was also a city councillor. I was an elected official in Victoria. And I can tell you that when you're an elected official, sometimes you see that there's a schism or a difference between, or a conflict between science and between public sentiment and policy. And I just want to say felicitación, Bogotá Humanos, for replacing fear, misinformation, and prejudice that comes with drug prohibition, and trying to replace that with science, reason, and compassion. So viva Bogotá. I'd like to start with by providing a bit of context for my current work and research with a brief overview of medical cannabis in Canada. Canada was one of the first countries in the world to implement a federal medical marijuana program, and this national policy did not come about because our government suddenly had compassion for sick and suffering Canadians who might benefit from the use of cannabis. Instead, the government was forced to create a federal program after patients who had been arrested for using or producing cannabis successfully had sued the government for arresting them. And so, as a result of that, and court decisions, we have a constitutional right to access medical cannabis in Canada. And now Canadian patients can use cannabis without fear of arrest and prosecution. And Health Canada, which is our federal health agency, was forced to implement the Medical Marijuana Access Regulations, otherwise known as the MMAR, in 2001 to govern medical cannabis and production. This program allowed patients affected by a number of medical conditions, including post-traumatic stress disorder, addiction, chronic pain, MS, epilepsy, to access medical cannabis with the support of their physician. It also allowed patients to grow plants for themselves. They're allowed to produce their own cannabis to treat themselves. However, the MMAR was plagued with a number of significant problems. There was a long and complex application process. You would go visit your doctor. It was a 33-page application. You'd send it off to the government. It would take 6 weeks to 6 months to process, and then you might get permission to use medical cannabis. For patients who were facing end-of-life situations, cancer patients who were dying within 4 to 8 weeks, this program was not protecting them. It was not helping them at all. There was also a lack of uptake on a very poor quality and limited supply of cannabis. The government licensed one company to produce a single strain of cannabis for patients in Canada, and it was so unpopular because of the lack of selection and the poor quality that fewer than 10% of patients in the program actually accessed that strain, with the remainder of patients buying cannabis from friends, from the black market, or from community-based dispensaries. And additionally, one of the other challenges was we had great resistance from the medical community, which I understand is one of the challenges here in Colombia as well. Doctors are not used to working with natural herbs and natural products. They're used to working with strict pharmaceuticals, pills, and that kind of treatment, so it can be challenging for the medical community to understand how to use and recommend medical cannabis use to patients. As a result of these challenges, the federal program was found unconstitutional or illegal at least 10 times between 2001 and 2011. In response to some of these ongoing challenges, in 2011, Health Canada announced a major overhaul of the federal medical cannabis program. And in April 2014, the new Medical marijuana, or the Marijuana for Medical Purposes regulations, or MNPR, replaced the old MMAR. As a result of this change, Health Canada now acts as a regulator rather than as a provider of medical cannabis, so the government no longer provides the cannabis, leaving cannabis production and distribution in the hands of privately owned or publicly traded commercial licensed producers. There are currently about 20 or so publicly owned or privately traded companies that act as both a pharmaceutical company in that they produce the cannabis and also the pharmacy in that they distribute it directly to patients. And in Canada, we ship cannabis directly to patients via mail. So the company I work for, Tilray, if you order your cannabis today, you would get it tomorrow in the mail anywhere in Canada. We ship it directly to the door. And I'd like to take you on a brief tour of my employer, Tilray, so you can get a sense of the size, scope, and sophistication of a federally authorized licensed producer in Canada. So this is our production facility. It's located in Nanaimo, BC. It's a 60,000 square foot production facility with 32 production rooms in it. We currently employ 190 full-time employees. We're the third biggest employer in our region, and we put $30 million into developing this production facility. This is what it looked like in February of 2014. And this is our vault, where we're allowed to store about $70 million worth of cannabis. And this is one of our production rooms as it's being constructed. This is what it looks like when it's finished. And now you can see it full of plants. We've got 35,000 plants in the production facility, 50 different strains, including 5 high CBD strains. You might have heard about CBD being useful in the treatment of childhood epilepsy. It helps reduce seizures with kids with certain conditions around childhood epilepsy. And so high CBD strains are becoming more and more important for therapeutic purposes, but they're not available on the black market because they don't give you the high that high THC strains do. This is a peek into our vault and one of our hallways. And so as you can see, this is quite different than a basement grow op or an outdoor production facility. This is highly secure, and right here you actually see a picture of Maria. Maria is our first patient. She's a former police officer who was injured in the course of duty and also suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder. And she uses cannabis to treat those conditions. And she found by using cannabis, she was able to give up all of the use of the pharmaceutical opiates, the prescription opiates she was using. She feels much better as a result. At the bottom, you can see some of our packaging where we list the THC and CBD levels of the cannabis so that patients have a good understanding of what it is they're using and they can use it with some predictability. We're licensed to produce cannabis from seed all the way through sale, and we also do an extensive amount of research at Tilray as well. And so at this time, Tilray has over 50 strains of cannabis, and we're teaming with Canadian and international researchers to supply and initiate clinical trials examining patient patterns of use, strain symptom correlations, and the impact of cannabis of different chemical composition on a number of chronic conditions, including addiction. For example, Tilray has partnered with the University of British Columbia to conduct a phase 2 clinical trial examining the therapeutic potential of cannabis in the treatment of PTSD that will focus on military and police veterans and victims of violent and sexual assault. Additionally, we're currently examining patient patterns of use and cannabis substitution effect with the University of Victoria and the Centre for Addictions Research of British Columbia. And we have studies on childhood epilepsy that are being considered right now in New York State, in the US, and also in Australia and New South Wales. Other areas of research that we're currently examining include adult epilepsy, HIV/AIDS, and cancer. Tilray is not alone in conducting research of this kind, and the past decade has seen a dramatic increase in interest in the therapeutic properties of cannabis. Concurrent with the increased recognition of legitimate medical cannabis use is an international reappraisal of prohibitions on recreational cannabis use, with nations like Portugal and Uruguay, and even US states like Colorado, Oregon, and Washington and Alaska exploring the potential costs and benefits of regulated adult access to cannabis. As we move away from a blanket prohibition on cannabis use, a better understanding of the consequences of cannabis use on the use of other psychoactive substances like prescription drugs, alcohol, and illegal drugs like cocaine crystal meth, and opiates would be helpful in assessing the potential health impacts and social costs associated with cannabis use. So while the past research suggested that cannabis may be a stepping stone or a gateway to hard drugs like cocaine and heroin, the gateway theory has now been effectively disproven by modern studies. In fact, recent research on a phenomenon known as cannabis substitution effect suggests that rather than being a gateway to addiction, many individuals who use cannabis can use it to serve as an exit drug to addiction and to problematic substance use. So substitution effect is a multifaceted phenomenon by which variations in the use and availability of one substance affects the use of another, and this provides a useful lens to examine the impact of cannabis use on the broader health burden associated with substance use. Prominent examples of harm reduction potential of substituting one psychoactive substance for another include the prescription use of methadone as a substitute for injection drug use, as well as nicotine patches or e-cigarettes to curb or stop tobacco smoking. The use of cannabis as a substitute for prescription drugs, alcohol, and other substances has been identified in a number of studies. A researcher named Karen Modell found that hard drug users shifted to cannabis after 13 US states decriminalized its use in the late 70s, and also findings from Australia's 2001 National Drug Use Survey specifically identify cannabis substitution amongst heroin and pharmaceutical opiate users when their drug of choice was unavailable. A number of smaller studies have also found that cannabis appears to reduce the cravings for other drugs of dependence like tobacco, opiates, and cocaine. For example, research shows that nicotine cravings can be modulated by the endocannabinoid system, and recent studies suggest that cannabinoid receptors interrupt signaling in the opioid receptor systems, affecting both cravings for opiates as well as withdrawal severity. In regards to cocaine, a study by the New York State Psychiatric Institute on people with cocaine dependence with comorbid attention deficit hyperactivity disorder found that cannabis users were more successful than non-users in abstaining from cocaine use. And an earlier study by Labigolini et al. Noted this effect on people with a dependence on crack cocaine, reporting that 68% of the 25 subjects who self-medicated with cannabis in order to reduce cravings were able to give up crack altogether. Additionally, recent research by both Schwartz and Scavone et al. Shows that cannabis use may improve some treatment outcomes for substance dependence, including opiate cravings. The following study expands upon prior research on cannabis substitution effect. The Cannabis Access for Medical Purposes Survey, or CAMPS, is the largest polling of Canadian medical cannabis patients to date. The principal investigator of the study is Dr. Zach Walsh, and the research was approved and reviewed by the University of British Columbia. It was a 414-page questionnaire that was available online and in writing and in person from 2011 and 2012, and it gathered information from 628 self-identified Canadian medical cannabis patients. In regards to demographics, comparisons of the sample to values from the Canadian Census Population Survey indicate that men, Caucasians, and Aboriginal participants were overrepresented compared to the general population, but we also find them overrepresented in our medical marijuana program as well. Medical cannabis patients were also younger, had a higher income, and were more likely to have completed high school than the average Canadian, and that may fly in the face a little bit or contradict some of the perceptions of who uses medical cannabis when you find out that they tend to be higher income and also have a higher education level than the general population. In terms of a history of medical cannabis use prior to therapeutic use, that was reported by 82% of patients. So most medical cannabis users have tried cannabis recreationally before they use it as a medicine. Average age of first use of recreational cannabis was 17 years old, which is actually higher than the Canadian average of 15 to 16 years old. And first therapeutic use was reported to occur at 28 years old on average, which shows that for patients, there's a clear distinction between their recreational use in the past and their present medical cannabis use. In terms of frequency of use, 42% of participants use cannabis 2 or 3 times a day, and 40% of patients reported using more than 14 grams per week. Of those reporting higher use, the median weekly amount used was 28 grams, so about 4 grams per day. And when asked what the preferred method of use was, 45% preferred smoking, 33% preferred vaporization, and 21% preferred to eat or orally ingest cannabis-infused products. This study was conducted a few years ago. The percentage of people who vaporize has grown since then, and I suspect it's closer to 50%. In regards to the impact of medical cannabis use on the use of other drugs, the CAMP study found that 87% of patients self-reported substituting cannabis for one or more of alcohol, illicit drugs, or prescription drugs, with 36% reporting substituting cannabis for a single class of substance, 25% for 2 classes of substances, and 26% substituting for all 3 classes of drugs. Examination by class of drug identified that substitution for prescription drugs was the most frequent at 80%, followed by alcohol at 52%, and finally illicit substances at 32%. As in previous studies, the most commonly endorsed reason for substitution were less adverse side effects and better symptom management. So people find cannabis less addictive than they do their traditional treatments or their other drugs of choice. And a novel finding was that younger patients were more likely to report substitution across all 3 classes of drugs than older patients. We suggest that there are at least 3 possible reasons for this novel finding. Older patients may have more established patterns of substance use than younger patients, and therefore they may be more fixed in the drug use patterns in the first place. Younger patients may simply use a greater variety of drugs and substances in the first place, so they may be more likely to substitute cannabis as a result. Or perhaps younger patients are more familiar with some of the anecdotal information around cannabis substitution effect, and therefore they're more likely to be engaged in deliberate substitution using cannabis. So what can we conclude from this research and previous studies on cannabis substitution effect? What does this all mean from a public health perspective? What does this all mean for the people of Bogota? Well, with the recent rise of addiction to pharmaceutical opiates in Canada and around the world, and an associated increase in opiate-related morbidity and mortality, the high rate of self-reported substitution for prescription substances, particularly among patients with pain-related conditions, suggests that further research into cannabis and cannabinoids as a safer substitute to opiates appears to be certainly justified. Additionally, since the intravenous use of opiates, of cocaine, of crack, and of crystal meth can all lead to the transmission of serious chronic conditions like HIV/AIDS and hepatitis C, evidence suggesting that cannabis might be an effective substitute for these highly addictive substances could be part of a public health-centered harm reduction strategy aimed at reducing disease transmission and overdoses from injection drug use. And furthermore, since alcohol has a far greater social health and financial impact on individuals and communities than all illicit drugs combined, public policies informed by the growing evidence that cannabis might reduce or even treat alcohol dependence could have a significant impact on the overall rates of alcoholism and consequently on alcohol-related automobile accidents, violence, and particularly domestic violence and violent crime, as well as property crime. So as we've heard here today, a growing body of evidence suggests that cannabis, once thought of as a gateway drug to addiction, may ultimately prove to be an exit drug to problematic substance use, given the credible biological, social, and psychological mechanisms behind these findings. In similar studies, further research is justified on both economic and on ethical grounds, and perhaps clinical trials with those who've had poor outcomes with conventional addiction therapies would be a good starting point, and I'm so excited to see that that's one of the policies that Bogota is currently considering to treat those who are addicted to bazuco. So in closing, I'd like to thank Dr. Zach Walsh, the principal investigator of the CAMPS study, and my co-researchers, Kim Crosby, Robert Calloway, Lynn Bellil, Susan Holtzman, Liel Kapler, and Bob Kay. And finally, my gratitude to the Center for Addictions Research in British Columbia, the University of Victoria, and Tilray for ongoing support of my research, and to Julian, the government of Bogota, for this opportunity to present here today, and all of you for your time and interest. I look forward to your questions. Gracias. Thank you.